You're listening to the VSL Aviation Podcast. I'm your host, Seth Lake, and this is episode 18. Thanks for listening. Thanks for watching again. If you're watching on YouTube, again, this is both a podcast and a YouTube show, so you can choose your way to watch. The first part of the show will be fine on the podcast. The second part, I'm going to be covering a new interactive ACS that I'll be releasing, and it really helps if you watch this. So if you're listening just on podcast, again, the next 10 minutes will be valuable, but then the last 10 minutes of the show, you'd probably be better served with YouTube. But stay tuned anyway. So we're going to finish up our discussion on the commercial airman certification standards. If this is your first time listening to the podcast, again, my name's Seth Lake. I am a designated pilot examiner, so I give check rides. And I think, or I wanted to give pilots kind of my view from an examiner's point of view on how best you can read and interpret this thing we call the ACS. So when you show up to the check ride, you're going to be better prepared. So the ACS, again, that's the document that we examiners are using to conduct a check ride. So when you show up to take your commercial check ride, your examiner they have to use the ACS, and the better you understand this document, the easier time that you're going to have during your check ride, kind of the less unknowns that are going to arise. Now, in the commercial ACS series, this is a 4-part series now. In parts 1, 2, and 3, I covered all the areas of operation, and that included area of operation 1, which is mainly the oral or the ground portion of the exam, and then area operation 2 through 11 are the flight portions of the commercial check ride. So today, since I've already covered all those for single engine, now I'm going to do a multi-engine series here shortly. But we've covered all the stuff for single engine. What I didn't cover is the stuff that's in the appendices. So the ACS has an appendix section that's rather lengthy, and there's a lot of the problem I have with the ACS. And I'm going to go ahead. If you're following along on the ACS, you can pull up on the appendix sections, the appendix table of contents. We have A1 through A18. Actually, maybe even more than that, A1 through A26. Yeah. So we have 10 appendices. The problem I have with this is a lot of these appendices could really, if I were king for a day, and if the administrator or any representative of the administrator is listening, what I would recommend on the ACS would be to have kind of an ACS legend or something that contains a lot of the stuff that's just generic to every single ACS, and that way we could shorten the appendices, and so they just contain the stuff that directly impacts the commercial ACS, for instance. But we don't have that, so no sense in complaining about it. But what I'm going to point out is there are 2 appendices that have really important things to say directly about the commercial ACS, and that's Appendix 6 and Appendix 7. So Appendix 6, this is our safety of flight. Any ACS series, the Appendix 6 is always safety of flight. This covers some of the stuff that you need to think about when you're doing, when you're doing the check ride to make sure you're doing it as safely as possible. So it talks about use of distractions and checklists and stall spin awareness and positive exchange of controls. And then on the second page of Appendix 6, towards the bottom, it has the multi-engine considerations. Again, we're going to cover that in our multi-engine exercise, but for the single-engine considerations, it talks about not simulating power plant failures in a single-engine airplane unless it's possible to safely complete a landing. So you wouldn't want to, as an examiner, I wouldn't want to fail your engine over an area where it would be very difficult or impossible for you to complete a safe landing. So I would want to limit that activity until we were at a location where we could do a safe landing. The second item it pulls up is the high-performance aircraft considerations, and that's when you're doing slow flight. So in particular, the slow flight is saying that in some high-performance airplanes, the power setting may have to be reduced below ACS guidelines power setting to prevent excessively high pitch attitudes greater than 30 degrees nose up. So if we go back to our slow flight and stalls area of operation, that's area of operation 7, task C, power on stalls. So task C and then skill, let's see, what is it? Skill 4. Skill 4 says to set power as assigned by the evaluator to no less than 65% power. So here's an example where the ACS is telling me to set 65% power, no less than that. Well, if I'm in a high-performance airplane, 65% power may cause me to get severely nose high, like over 30 degrees nose high. So Appendix 6 is saying, hey, it's okay to set a lower power setting than 65% in a high-performance airplane so you don't get excessively nose high. So that's an example of that safety of flight. Now, next we have Appendix 7. Appendix 7 I call is kind of our amplifying remarks for the different areas of operation. So it starts out by talking about aircraft requirements and limitations. It goes into equipment requirements and limitations, so you can read through that. It's all pretty standard stuff of what you would expect. It's basically saying make sure that you're bringing an aircraft that has all the required equipment operative for the test. So hopefully we don't need to cover that. Don't bring a broken airplane to your check ride. But then on the next page, it goes into the specific areas of operation, and I'll call these amplifying remarks. So for area of operation 5, performance and ground reference maneuvers, it says for initial commercial applicants seeking an ASEL or ASES, which is airplane single engine land or airplane single engine sea rating, the evaluator must choose Task A, steep turns, or Task B, steep spiral, Task C, chandelles, or Task D, lazy eights, and Task E, eights on pylons. So it's basically giving me as an examiner a menu of things to choose from Area of Operation 5. So if we go back to Area of Operation 5 in the meat of the ACS, it doesn't say anything in here about only needing to do steep turns or steep spirals. From the looks of it, it looks like you have to do both. But Appendix 7 basically says you can choose either or. And then the same thing with Task C, it's chandelles or Task D, lazy eights. You don't have to do both necessarily. The way this is worded, it almost makes it sound like we have to choose steep spirals or steep turns and chandelles or lazy eights. So I think the ACS is still worded in other places where the examiner can examine you on all of this stuff if they wanted to. So an examiner, I don't think, would be wrong for examining you on every single task in Area of Operation 5. But the examiner is only required to do to examine you on 3 of those tasks. So we have A, B, C, D, and E. So we have 5 tasks in Area of Operation 5, and really you only have to demonstrate 3 of those. And of those 3, the options are listed in Area of Operation 7 back here. So that's what your examiner should be choosing from. Now, if they choose to examine you on all 5, I would not cause a fuss about that, because I think they're well within their right to examine you on all 5 of those maneuvers. But the ACS does allow them to only do 3 of those maneuvers as long as it's in line with what Appendix 7 tasks here. Next, we have slow flight installs. Now, the first one, it says Task A, maneuvering during slow flight. I'll go ahead and read it out. Evaluation criteria for the task should recognize the environmental factors, e.g. turbulence, may result in a momentary activation of the stall warning indicators, such as the stall horn. If the applicant recognizes the stall warning indication and promptly makes an appropriate correction, a momentary activation does not constitute unsatisfactory performance on this task. As with other tasks, unsatisfactory performance would arise from an applicant's continual deviation from the standard, lack of correction, and or lack of recognition. So that's a pretty clarifying statement, right? If you look at Task A in the slow flight, again, meat of the ACS in the skill area, it says, well, let's go ahead and read that. Just Task A of slow flight. It is Skill 3, establish and maintain an airspeed at which any further increase in angle of attack, increase in load factor, or reduction in power would result in a stall warning. So it says, not be in the stall warning right above the stall warning. So you could interpret that as if the stall warning comes on, well, you've just failed the maneuver. Well, that's why they added this to Appendix 7, saying that if the stall horn comes on during slow flight, doesn't mean you've automatically failed, because there could be environmental factors that would cause the stall warning horn to come on inadvertently. So as long as you're making a prompt corrective action, then we're good to go there. So that's good. Now, power on stalls. Power on stalls, power off stalls, and accelerated stalls, all for single engine stuff. They all have the same statement. And that statement says, evaluation criteria for a recovery from an approach to stall should not mandate a predetermined value for altitude loss and should not mandate maintaining altitude during recovery. Proper evaluation criteria should consider the multitude of external and internal variables which affect the recovery altitude. So this is basically telling us to not do what the old PTS said, which is to minimize altitude loss during the stall recovery. In fact, I think some older PTSs would even say you're limited to only lose like 200 feet during the stall. So that's not a thing anymore. We don't care how much altitude you lose. It just doesn't need to be excessive. So it turned it into a lot more subjective thing. We just didn't want that negative training to happen where you were so worried about altitude loss during a stall that you didn't break the stall enough. You didn't let the nose down enough or unload the wing properly. And what that would cause is a secondary stall, which is often also an accelerated stall, which could basically aggravate the situation and make it even worse. So instead, it's all about breaking the stall. We're not worried about altitude loss. We're worried about breaking the stall. And then once the stall is broken, then making a smooth recovery. So we're no longer worried about altitude loss. The next two amplifying remarks are for area of operation 9, which is for multi-engine operations for 9 and 10. So we're not going to cover that in this episode. And then on the next page, this is all about multi-engine stuff. So there's several more multi-engine considerations to take into account, but we're not going to cover that again because we're doing a separate multi-engine show at a later date. Here, coming up real short. Okay, so we've covered area of operation Appendix 6 and Appendix 7. So hopefully that gives you an idea a little bit better about how the appendices are working. Now, if we go to our table of contents, I am going to show you one other appendix, and this is Appendix 5. So this is your roles and responsibilities. So this outlines your responsibilities as an applicant, your instructor's responsibilities, and then my responsibilities, which I'm the evaluator. So this is kind of a good overview of what my responsibilities are. On the next page over from that, on A9, it talks about possible outcomes of the test. So here's where it covers the temporary airman certificate, which is a satisfactory pass, a notice of disapproval, which is unsatisfactory, or a letter of discontinuance, which is basically an official way to pause the check ride. It goes on to define kind of satisfactory performance, but what I'm going to read to you now is where it talks about unsatisfactory performance. Are you nervous about an upcoming check ride? Have you ever wondered what it's like to be a designated pilot examiner? In this show, I give you a behind-the-scenes look of the FAA check ride process. I'll show you best practices on how to have a successful check ride, common errors that applicants struggle with, and share with you some of the valuable knowledge I've gained throughout my 15-year career in military and civilian aviation. For more information about the show, visit our website, vsl.aero/podcast. There you'll find the show library, various ways to support the show, and links to purchase our interactive Airman Certification Standards Study Guide. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and leave a 5-star review. And most importantly, tell your aviation friends about the show. This is listener-supported content, and I'm planning on keeping it that way. So any way you can support the show through Patreon or PayPal is greatly appreciated. Consider how much you would normally pay for an hour of ground school with an experienced CFI. Thanks for listening, and back to the show. I think I'm going to do a whole show. I'd like to hear your feedback on this, but I would like to do a whole show on failing a check ride because I think there's a lot of angst. Well, me personally, I've felt it. Whenever you go to a check ride, you're like, what's going to happen if I fail? You know, is my flying career over after I fail a check ride? And that's just not the case. Failing a check ride or receiving an unsatisfactory during a check ride is not the end of the world, not even close. It's not really a big deal at all. It's just something that that happens in aviation. And if it happens, there's a very clear path for you to get back healthy, and it's not a big deal. But for now, let's just talk about what an unsatisfactory performance includes. And again, this is reading straight from the ACS. Typical areas for unsatisfactory performance and grounds for disqualification include any action or lack of action by the applicant that requires corrective intervention by the evaluator to maintain safe flight. So if I have to snatch the controls from you, say my controls to keep us from crashing, then that's an automatic disapproval. Failure to use proper and effective visual scanning techniques to clear the area before and while performing maneuvers. So if you're not looking outside, clearing the area, performing clearing turns, that's grounds for unsatisfactory performance. Consistently exceeding tolerances stated in the skill element of the task. That's a very interesting way to word this, right? So notice the FAA did not say exceeding tolerances stated in the skill element. They said consistently exceeding tolerances. So that must mean that if I exceed them once or twice, that's not really consistently. So I can still exceed the tolerances, but as long as I'm not doing it a lot, that's not necessarily grounds for disapproval. Perfection isn't the standard. That's what they should have just written, but instead they, probably wisely, were a little more specific than that. The next bullet is failure to take prompt corrective action when tolerances are exceeded. Again, that's a very interesting choice of phraseology there. The FAA knows that words matter, and words do matter. And they said, failure to take prompt corrective action when tolerances are exceeded. So that must mean that taking prompt corrective action when tolerances are exceeded would be not grounds for failure, right? That's within what would be satisfactory performance. So that just reiterates the fact that perfection isn't the standard here. So that should make you feel a lot better. And then the last one is failure to exercise risk management. That's kind of a broad term, and that could mean a lot of different things, right? Not using a checklist, not doing a pre-flight pre-takeoff briefing, or talking about emergency equipment. I mean, there's a lot of things that are involved in risk management there, so that's kind of a catch-all. And then the last paragraph there is, if in the judgment of the evaluator, the applicant does not meet the standards for any task, the applicant fails the task and associated area of operation. The test is unsatisfactory, and the evaluator issues a notice of disapproval. The evaluator lists the area or areas of operation in which the applicant did not meet the standard, any area or areas of operation not tested, and the number of practical test failures. The evaluator should also list the tasks failed or tasks not tested within any unsatisfactory or partially completed area of operation if the applicant's inability to meet the English language requirements contributed to the failure of the task. The evaluator must note English proficiency on the notice of disapproval. The evaluator or the applicant may end the test if the applicant fails a task. The evaluator may continue the test only with the consent of the applicant. The applicant is entitled to credit only for those areas of operation and the associated tasks performed satisfactorily. So that kind of spells out what's going to happen during a disapproval. I think I was on Reddit where somebody was arguing, well, the examiner has to let you know as soon as you fail. And that's sort of correct. But remember, we're trying to gauge consistency here, right? And if we're gauging consistency, then that means we have to allow you the opportunity to be consistent. You don't want us to let you know as soon as you fail, because what that means is as soon as you exceed a tolerance, I have to say, hey, that you just exceeded the tolerance of the ACS. That's going to be a disapproval. Would you like to continue the test or go back? Those are your two options. Now, you don't want that to happen, right? So what generally winds up happening is on a disapproval, you might have heard the term, death by 1,000 cuts. But it is kind of like that because we're seeing consistency develop. So let's say you exceed the tolerances on your steep turn. Well, if it was a momentary deviation and you corrected back and you did that maybe once or twice, then that's within the guidelines of the ACS. I'm not going to issue a disapproval for that. So then we go into slow flight. And on slow flight, there's several times the stall horn comes on, and the air's pretty smooth. There's not any outside reasons for that. And so now we're teetering on consistently exceeding tolerances here, right? Because that's 2 maneuvers now that you exceeded tolerances on. And then we go to the approaches. And when we're doing the approaches, you're consistently below your approach speed on a couple of the landings. So now there's been 3 different tasks where you demonstrated that you were consistently below the stated the skill elements. That's when I might elect to say, all right, based on your consistently exceeding tolerances and failure to take prompt corrective action, I'm going to issue a disapproval for areas of operation, 4, 6, and 9, whatever they are. It's within my right as my ability as a DPE to do that, because and you demonstrated that consistency of exceeding tolerances. So in that case, you're not going to hear right away that you failed. It's going to be after the third maneuver or whatever your examiner chooses to call it. But at that point, the examiner does, when we decide to issue the disapproval, we do need to let you know that right away. And so we're not going to wait until we get back in the office and say, hey, by the way, that's going to be a disapproval. We're not going to do that. It'll be in the aircraft. And in the aircraft, you have the option to stop the check ride or continue. Notice that I don't have the right to push you to continue. So you always have the choice there. Now, it doesn't say that I must let you continue, right? I may let you continue. So I've got a lot of experience giving check rides, and I kind of know when I'm doing a check ride, the way the applicant reacts to a disapproval in the air. I may say, hey, let's just go ahead and go back to the airport. I think we need to call it a day. I'm just going to have you go land. I'll write up the disapproval. You get to keep credit for all the stuff you did satisfactorily. So you're only going to have to test the stuff that you did unsatisfactorily. But I'm not going to allow you to keep flying the airplane necessarily. Because in my judgment, it may be that had a bigger impact, and you just need to call it a day, take a deep breath, come back a couple of days later, and retest. So a discontinuance or unsatisfactory performance, we have 60 days to clean it up. And the way I look at a disapproval, again, is it's more of like a grade to 100 scenario. So like if you go in and take a quiz, let's say you take a math quiz back in high school, and you miss 5 questions on that quiz, and the teacher says, hey, Seth, you missed these 5 questions. Here's the quiz back. I want you to answer those correctly and bring it back. So I take the test. I grade it back to 100, hand it back in. Teacher looks at it, grades everything. It's to 100. Hey, you're good to go. You passed the quiz. So that's kind of what we're doing here as the check ride is you come in, you get a disapproval for 2 different areas of operation. I'm going to issue the disapproval for that. You're going to go get additional training on those, come back and retest just on those areas of operation and any areas of operation that you didn't do. And then as long as you pass that, I'll issue a temporary certificate and you pass. Not a big deal. Yeah, sure, it goes on your record. And in the future, you will have to say, yes, I've failed a check ride before. But the way I think about it is when you fail a check ride, which I have failed check rides before, by the way, when you fail a check ride and that comes up in an interview, because that's really the only context that this will ever come up with. Like if somebody comes to me for their commercial and they failed their private, I don't care. I don't even ask them about it. So it doesn't come up really within the FAA. It's really more of you're interviewing for a job and you failed a check ride. For the way I look at it is that's your opportunity to predict what they're going to ask about during an interview, and you get to really prepare for that. And that's kind of a time during an interview that you know is going to be asked about. in most other interview questions, you don't really know what they're going to ask. But when you have a check ride failure, you know that they're going to ask about that. And that's going to give you the opportunity to give an awesome answer, which is, hey, I learned a lot when I failed this check ride. It made me a better pilot. I understood better some of my weaknesses, and I was able to learn and get better. And so if you approach a failure, from a standpoint of being humble and that you learned about it, there is absolutely no employer that's going to hold that against you. Even if you have a couple of check ride failures, like you passed or you just say you fail your instrument and your commercial, and you feel like, oh man, my career is over. Well, no, absolutely not. In fact, I employ people. I've hired pilots. I sit on a hiring board for the Air Force Reserves, and just because I see a failure on the check ride doesn't mean that I'm not going to hire that person because, oh, they must be a terrible pilot. Because let's face it, check rides are stressful, and sometimes you do boneheaded things during check rides because you're stressed out. So I totally get it. I've failed check rides before. It's not fun, but it's not the end of the world. Trust me. All right. So this is the part, I'm going to call that good for the commercial ACS for the single engine. So I hope you enjoyed that. Hope that clarified the amplifying remarks stuff on that helps. What I'm going to do now is take just a few minutes to introduce you to my interactive airman certification standards. So this is going to be available for purchase on our website. So vsl.aero/podcast. You'll be able to find a link where you can download this, purchase it. I think it'll be $45. It'll also be on my new Patreon channel. I guess it's a channel. I don't know. I'm kind of very new to Patreon. So if you want to support the show, you can go to Patreon, and on the highest member level subscription, you would have access to all of these interactive ACS. Right now I have it for the instrument and commercial. And then as soon as they get the instructor ACS released, I will make one for instructor. And then I'm working on the ATP ACS as well. So those are all going to be interactive and hyperlinked. And if you don't know what that means, you can watch the YouTube video, and I'll tap you through here. Now, this is meant to be used on a tablet or work on a desktop. I'm using it on my laptop right now. So all these gray buttons are just that. They're buttons. They're kind of hyperlinks. So it lists all the areas of operation, so I can skip directly to, let's say, area of operation 5. Now, based on area of operation 5, I see that this is a multi-requirement, and that it also has amplifying remarks in Appendix 7. And then I can also, I've embedded the Airplane Flying Handbook. So the AFH Chapter 10 has a link down here, and it takes you to Chapter 10 Performance Maneuvers. Now, notice the Airplane Flying Handbook is also fully embedded in this. All 18 chapters of the Airplane Flying Handbook, as well as all 17 chapters of the Pilot's Handbook of Aeronautical Knowledge. These are also individually hyperlinked, so you can navigate through all the chapters. And I think, honestly, it's much easier to use than what the FAA version is. I think mine's a little bit more user-friendly. I've also embedded the Pilot Guide to Preflight Briefing. That's an advisory circular, 9192. So that's a really handy document that takes you through how to develop your pre-flight briefing. If you look on one of the last pages of this, it gives you an actual checklist, Appendix B, a sample pre-flight checklist, that really, if you use this checklist when you're preparing for any flight, and especially your check ride, you're going to meet all the requirements and have a successful outcome of that flight. So it's a really good checklist to use there. But anyway, that's hyperlinked in there, as well as your table of contents of the Airman Certification ACS itself, and then the multi-add-on additional task table, which we're going to go into commercial add-on, and specifically the multi-engine commercial add-on. That'll be the next series of podcasts that I do and videos, and that'll be coming out very, very soon. So stay tuned for that. So this is the Interactive ACS. It includes the PHAC, the AFH, Pilot's Guide to Pre-Flight Briefing, and the ACS. It's linked. The maneuvers are tied into the AFH or the PHAC, and I think it's a great way to study. I tried to make it as easy as possible. What I want you to do as an applicant, as a pilot, is to use this source data. There's a lot of gouge out there. There's a lot of YouTube videos, but this is giving you the source data, and it's making it easy to reference. So you're not hopping around to 3 or 4 different documents to find the information. So it's kind of a study guide / little ecosystem you can just pull up and reference and have access to all this stuff. So I think it's a really useful document. I think you'll like it. I'm excited to hear your feedback on it. So let me know what you think. Again, if you want to purchase it, go to vsl.aero. There'll be a link right there on the landing page to purchase the Interactive ACS, or go to Patreon. The benefit to Patreon is that these are versioned. So I'm going to update these continually and have different digital downloads available. And if you're on that highest level of Patreon membership, you'll get an alert each time a new thing drops, and you'll be able to download it. You won't have to purchase them piecemeal as it goes. So it's something I'm pretty excited about, and look forward to hearing from you. And by the way, on the feedback, I've loved getting feedback both on email and a lot of YouTube comments, but especially the emails. It really means a lot when you reach out to me on email, kind of that personal touch, and you tell me, hey Seth, your stuff has really helped me pass the check ride. That really gives me the motivation to continue doing this stuff. So I appreciate it, and keep it coming. Anyway, I'm blabbering now, so I'm going to sign off here. Thanks again for watching and listening. See ya.